Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and today my guest is Jennifer Roig Francoli, an Alexander Technique teacher in Cincinnati, Ohio. She teaches the technique at the University of Cincinnati College Conservatory of Music, Xavier University, and she also has a private practice. She works a lot with performers as well as other people, and she's also a violinist. And more to the point for this conversation, she is the developer of what's come to be called Freedom Directions, which are a new approach to Alexander Technique self-direction. We've done one podcast on this topic, and we are going to do sort of part two of that. Jennifer, welcome to the show.
Hi, Robert. Thanks so much for having me back.
Hey, it's a pleasure. It really is. So we had talked a little before the podcast, and you had mentioned that one of the things you want to do is relate these directions, these freedom directions, to the Alexander Technique concept of inhibition.
Yes, which is, as we know, a rather large topic.
Mm-hmm.
And I admit I'm feeling rather daunted to talk about this topic right now. However, I think it's extremely important. And the reason I asked you to do a part two connecting to the first podcast we did is that even though the first one felt like it was complete, over the next few days, there was this sense that I had not talked about how I see them related to inhibition. Mm-hmm. So I feel it's important to do this podcast, even though I'm nervous about it. And here's a perfect example of how I use my freedom directions in the moment where I am feeling nervous right now. So I use the thought, I am free to feel nervous. Mm-hmm. And just that in itself starts to free me up because it's giving me permission to experience how I am in this present moment. And for me, that is all about what this technique is about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Maybe it would be good if you could just say a quick word about what Alexander Technique teachers or Alexander meant by the term inhibition. And I suppose it would be helpful to distinguish it from Mr. Freud's version of inhibition, which is completely different.
Right. Yeah. And there are many ways you can define inhibition, of course. So any definition is going to be incomplete. Mm-hmm. But I like to think of inhibition as a stopping. It is, if you think of a thought as a sequence of neurons firing to connect to each other, and eventually if you allow them to continue firing through the nervous system, then they could end up triggering muscles to contract, and you could end up with a sense of tension in your body, which can be a very good thing. Mm-hmm. So inhibition is actually stopping that sequence of events. And the more we inhibit, and the more we can actually get back to the root of, like stopping the chain reaction from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. So we're stopping the thoughts that lead to muscular tension that we don't want, though, right?
Right. Well, or maybe that we do want. I don't know. Inhibition, it just, without saying whether we want something or not, it is actually a conscious stopping of an event, I think. Mm-hmm. Or it's a stopping of our reaction to a stimulus. Let's put it that way.
Right, right. And how do freedom thoughts relate to that?
That's the question. So I think that one of our... If we're thinking of inhibition as stopping a habit, that's another way of thinking about inhibition, mm-hmm. then what habit are we inhibiting by thinking I am free? Well, I think that a big human habit is to identify ourselves with limitation. Essentially, we believe deep down that we are limited. And one of the main identifications we have is to limit ourselves to believing that we are this mind and this body.
Mm-hmm.
So we're ultimately believing I am not free. So I was thinking about this morning, and I think even before you think I am free, there is some sort of an inhibition where we're opening up the mind to the possibility that perhaps we can identify with something greater than our habit. So if I ask my student, for instance, are you free? Or myself, if I ask myself, am I free right now?
Mm-hmm.
Then I am just opening up the door. So that, in a sense, is already a kind of inhibition where I'm just opening up my mind, my mind body self to possibility.
Mm-hmm.
So
So,
that's even before I think this direction of I am free, I need to be open to the possibility that it might be true.
mm-hmm. And the thoughts, let's say that are connected with limitations. You're really wanting to, in a sense, find out what they are and nip them in the bud, so to speak.
Yeah, I would like not even just thoughts, although they do come down to thoughts, I think. The way I am using how I described it in the last podcast was easy because it's very practical and it's already what I'm doing. So this podcast is a little more challenging because I want to talk about the sort of the meaning behind the whole thing. And I I think that free will is not something mental. Freedom is something that belongs to a part of us that's much deeper. It's not a thought. It's actually, Alexander referred to. I think that's what he's referring to on page 1 of his first book, Man's Supreme Inheritance.
Mm-hmm.
I left this quote out in case I felt like reading it.
Yes, let's hear it.
It's my favorite quote. And
Right?
I think it is significant that it's on the first page of his first book.
Uh-huh.
So I'll just quote from FM. He says, I should like in passing to point out that the theory and practice of my system are influenced by no particular religion nor school of philosophy, but in one sense may be said to embrace them all. And here's where it comes to connecting to the freedom ideas. So he says, for whatever name we give to the great origin of the universe, in the words of a friend of mine, he quotes, we can all of us agree that we mean the same thing, namely, that high power within the soul of man, which enables him to will or to act or to speak, not loosely or wildly, but in subjection to an all-wise and invisible authority, end quote. The name that we give to that authority will in no way affect the principles which I am about to state. In subscribing to them, the mechanist may still retain his belief in a theory of chemical reactions, no less than the Christian his faith in the great Redeemer. And that's the end of FM's quote.
Wow. So that, I'd forgotten that. And it's funny because we don't normally associate Alexander with that super deep level of thinking, or if that, and that's maybe not the right word. But so it sounds like you're saying that it's not so much just that we're learning how to stop thinking thoughts that aren't helpful, which of course
No.
we are, but that it's
Mm-hmm.
bigger than that, that
Yes.
it's more a connecting with for want of a better word, a higher reality about ourselves.
Absolutely. I really believe that this is about making good use of our free will, ultimately.
Hmm.
And he talks about a high power within the soul, which enables us to will or to act or to speak in subjection to an all wise and invisible authority. And I think that people tend to react to this idea of being subject to an authority, an authority that could be all wise and invisible. But it is pretty essential, in my opinion, to grasping like you said, the depth of Alexander's work, because that authority, and what's beautiful and I think brilliant on FM's part, is to say we can call this all wise invisible authority by whatever name that we want. So, and it is something inside us. It's innate. And I think that the prerogative of the human state that we enjoy is that we have this free will. So we can choose to use this free will to either accept how things are, to accept what is, and learn to love it and embody it with full consciousness, or we can choose to use our free will to reject and resist what is, and we can create internal war with reality. So one of those leads to feeling good, and the other one doesn't.
Right.
It comes down to that.
And the fundamental, I mean, among the many fundamental realities that we humans exist in or a part of are our physical structure, right? And of course, Alexander was very interested in our head, neck, upper torso relationship. Another fundamental reality we live in is that there is a sort of a relatively constant atmosphere that we live in that has a certain pressure, and we our breathing should ideally be in accordance, should take account of that reality. And I would add that another reality that we live in is the gravitational field.
You've done really excellent work on that.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think that's a reality that is a perfect example of what you just said. You could be at war with it, and many people are, and many people disparage it. I mean, that's
right.
And that's not usually going to work out real well for you. Or you could take a look at it and say, how does it work? And how does it work on me specifically? And how can I use that information? And how can I make changes in myself to take better advantage of it?
And how can I be in the best possible relationship with that?
Yes, absolutely. Because, just to take gravity as an example, and I'm sure we could say the same sort of things about the atmospheric pressure, which of course is it only exists because of gravity. If gravity were to change just a tiny bit in one direction or another, we'd be dead instantly. Pretty much instantly, a couple of breaths later.
Flatten like a pancake.
Yeah, really. But that's a perfect example because gravity, the gravitational field, is exerting a force on us. And as those of us who've studied physics know that force and energy are just two different words for the same thing. We are getting free energy for nothing. And we have a choice whether to use it or not, or to sort of fight it, not accept it freely, as it were. And that kind of takes us right back into freedom directions.
Yes, and you're talking about external influences, which are constantly present, whether it's gravity or a relationship with a certain person that's putting pressure or whatever. It's how we experience the pressure is a good word, or whatever the stimulus is that's coming from outside. It's how do we experience that and how do we respond to that, and do we do it in a conscious way and aware that we have the free will to respond to it for better or for worse. I think that there is a universal motivation that all of us as human beings have, which is to actually experience our free will and ultimately to experience goodness in our lives. And we call it good use. But I think that people like to feel good. They want to feel good. And this is a sort of an outgrowth of what I'm now calling the basic freedom directions. But another podcast maybe in the future is the outgrowth of got one way that this grows into a discussion of values and morals. And I don't think that Alexander Technique is moral, but there is something in us that does tend to goodness. And so it would be interesting to discuss that too.
Absolutely. You had mentioned the external forces of other people around us. Mm-hmm. So if we could take this to a very practical example with that kind of thing that people run into all the time, which is, quote, troublesome, unquote, other people.
Challenging. Let's put
Challenging, yes.
I like that word.
And so, a very simple classic example might be you're driving along and someone cuts you off. Mm-hmm. And the natural reaction is to get angry.
That's one possible
reaction. It's a possible reaction.
Right.
And maybe so someone who's in that situation and is experienced or knows about freedom directions and that whole concept, how might they have a different way of responding?
Well, it depends at which point you catch yourself.
Of course, yeah.
Ideally,
just before the person cuts you off, right?
Exactly.
Right, but let's say that doesn't happen.
Let's say you've reacted already, and you're getting really annoyed, and you're already thinking, "Oh, what a jerk!"
Right.
So then, at that moment, you might start to not feel very good, which is likely. So then, all right, let's say this were me, possibly. Mm-hmm. So I might start to think, well, I'm free to think that guy's a jerk, and I'm free to feel lousy. I'm free to feel angry and annoyed and irritated, and I'm free to choose what to do about it. Mm-hmm. I could chase that guy down and I don't know, honk my horn and cause an accident or something, or I'm free to just let myself think these things and feel what it feels like, and until I decide to do something different, which might be to not want to feel like that anymore. It's like, if it doesn't feel good, why do I want to keep doing it? Surprisingly, we keep doing a lot of things that don't feel good, even if we're aware of it. But at some point, usually, it starts to feel so bad that we actually decide we want to do something about it. So if I got to that point, then I would think, and this is where explicit inhibition direction comes in for me, where I would think, well, I'm free to stop thinking this. I'm free to stop thinking this way, or to stop thinking this guy's an idiot. Right. And I'm free to stop doing whatever I'm doing within myself to create this experience of unpleasant sensation. So basically, and I don't even need to know what I'm doing exactly. It all falls under the umbrella of the habit, capital T, capital H, the habit, which is part of my human nature. So first of all, I'm accepting that I'm human and it's okay to think these things. It's okay to feel these things. I'm free. I mean, that's the whole point of being human, is to experience the whole range. So I'm free to experience this unpleasantness, but I'm also free to stop doing the habit which continues it. So it's like a self-feeding loop that it sucks me down farther and further. I can stop the loop.
How important do you think it is to take that first step that you've mentioned, which is to say, I'm free to be angry at this person, or something like that, instead of just going to, like if we went with on the physical side of things, how about I'm free, or my neck is free, or something like that. In other words, just go directly to a physical correlate and affirm the freedom of that. Do you think it's crucial to to do that almost like a two-stage process that you outlined?
See, I'm not really sure if the first part is actually implicit already. If I were to start with the thinking, I'm free, actually, I think it is implicit. So it is possible for me to just think, I'm free.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is that I need to be aware of what I'm doing. So I automatically, if I think now, because I've been practicing it, it's becoming more automatic. I'm thinking I'm free and to be exactly the way I am right now. And that's what I want, ultimately. I want to be free to be exactly who I am right now. And if that includes some thoughts that are giving me an unpleasant experience, well, that's the way it is. And it is essential and crucial and absolutely necessary to accept that experience. Otherwise, I'm blocking it out. I'm splitting myself. I am
Mm-hmm.
creating separation and I'm rejecting reality, which is ultimately not going to make me feel good.
Mm-hmm. What I've noticed using freedom directions, and I've started since our first conversation, excuse me, I've started using that in my teaching,
Mm-hmm.
and I've been amazed on many levels.
I'm so happy you're using it. And
I'm,
Imogen, that podcast with Imogen was
yeah,
wonderful.
she,
Really
another
enjoyed listening
teacher
to
we
that.
did a podcast with, who's also been using it. I'm amazed on many levels, including the ease of teaching them and also the transferability of
Mm,
them from students to friends of them or husbands or wives.
mm.
It's
That's
astonishing,
wonderful.
really. But
Wow.
to get back to your kind of bigger picture,
Yes.
but I mean, your bigger picture suggests that it might be useful to acknowledge the unpleasant feeling that you have in a
Yes.
situation. But for people who are using freedom directions for what we might call more mundane purposes,
Mm-hmm.
like say I'm walking and
Mm-hmm.
I realize that it's possible I might be able to walk with a little greater ease. And
Mm-hmm.
if I say I'm free to walk, or my walking is free, or some such version of freedom directions,
Mm-hmm.
there is kind of an instantaneous um, change
I think there
for the
is.
better
Mm-hmm.
without going through a two-step process. That's
Yeah,
what
I
I'm
agree.
saying.
And you know what? After our first podcast, I started experimenting myself with your comments on maybe we could just skip all those questions and all the philosophy and all the stuff that I tend to start with. So
Hmm.
I've skipped it sometimes, and
Hmm.
it works just as well. My question is, well, it depends. I don't think it's essential to go through all the preliminary steps, but I just feel like maybe it's just me. I want my students to really understand what's behind it so that it sticks better.
Right.
I
Well,
don't know.
what I've done is with some of my students, I've just started right out with the freedom versions.
Hmm.
But after they've done some experimenting with that, the ones that I feel would benefit from it, I mention that it's somewhat in my mind, maybe I probably not as much in your mind, but in my mind, a version of Alexander negative directions, which have been
Yes.
around for a while,
Hmm.
and I'll explain to them that it's another way of saying the same thing that has
Yes.
a little more. It's a little more efficient. It's typically a shorter phrase, which is
Hmm.
always good. You don't have to deal with people's negative reactions to negative directions,
Right.
which occasionally happens.
Yeah,
And
sometimes they're hard to wrap your brain around
they're
too.
hard
Like
to,
if you're sitting in a chair and you're thinking, I'm not sitting in a
right.
chair,
Oh,
that takes a little explanation too.
right. And I think I mentioned I had a student that I asked her if she'd be
Yes.
okay saying I'm not sitting. She said, no, I wouldn't
Right.
because I am. So you don't have to deal
Mm.
with that.
Although
Um,
I must say there are some students who do not immediately take to the thought I'm free either, which is
Yeah,
part of why I
I
usually
haven't
go
run
through the
into that
process.
yet, but I could well imagine there might
Hmm.
be some. But I think to me, the way I look at the current state of freedom directions is first of all, it's pretty new, and there's going to be hopefully people exploring it and making new discoveries about it and how to use it, but also that it's a very open-ended process.
Yes.
Students can take these and use them in all sorts of ways that their teacher might never have thought of.
Right.
And
because they're free, and they start to realize
Yeah.
they're free to do whatever they want with these directions.
Absolutely. I mean, negative directions had some of those same qualities too.
Yes.
I've had students who've run with those in very interesting directions, but it seems to me freedom directions even more so. And it's almost like freeing Alexander's original basic idea that he expressed in those words you read earlier. It's almost like freeing that from necessarily being something that only Alexander technique teachers can convey.
Right.
For one thing.
I don't think we are the only ones.
No, we
In fact,
definitely are not the only ones. But kind of freeing it from all the structures around Alexander's work.
Yes.
Which is pretty revolutionary, Jennifer. Something, someday you're going to get a lot of credit, but you might get some blame too.
I don't doubt it.
Got to learn to live with that.
That comes with the territory.
Yeah.
People are free to criticize.
Well, and I think it would be nice to just put out an invitation to anyone who's listening to this, whether they're a student of the technique or a teacher or just someone who stumbled onto it and has started exploring these directions. If they would like, for example, to do a podcast or to write something about their experience, I'll put it in an appropriate place on one of my websites, or we'll do a podcast, or they might want to contact you, Jennifer. We'll put a link to your site, because I really think we're kind of starting something here.
Yes, and it is limitless.
It really,
it's limitless.
I think it is.
Right.
I mean, you've given me something to wrap my mind around with those big thoughts at the beginning.
Right. I feel like that's our function, is to just
put it out there and let it.
Somehow the silence was all that was coming, because I think that's the answer. It's like our function is to get out of the way.
Absolutely.
And to allow that, how does he put it? That all-wise and invisible authority, which I see as, and I experience as, from without and from within, to allow that to move us, so that we can move others, we can be moved, we can move and be moved, and with freedom. I think that's what we're doing here. At least that's what I hope I'm doing.
Well, I think that'd be a perfect note on which to bring our conversation to an end. What do you think?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Robert.
Oh,
it's such a pleasure to
this is really exciting stuff. We're talking, by the way, just for historical purposes, in mid-October 2013, and I'm going to guess that there'll be many more podcasts and writings and so on this topic. So my guest today has been Jennifer Roig-Francoulis, an Alexander Technique teacher in Cincinnati, Ohio. If anything that we've talked about interests you and you live in the Cincinnati area, we'll put a link to her website and you can contact Jennifer. We'll also put a link to a website where you can locate an Alexander teacher anywhere in the world. Not all Alexander Technique teachers at this point in time are familiar with freedom directions, but I think a lot of them are familiar with a precursor called negative directions, and they are certainly familiar with the precursor of that, traditional Alexander directions. So you can probably get some help on this from any Alexander teacher.
And thank you so much, Robert.
Oh, well.
I look forward to the next time.
Absolutely.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.